April's NFL Public Forum topic is Resolved: The continuation of current U.S. anti-drug policy in Latin America does more harm than good. Overall, this is a fairly balanced resolution, probably leaning slightly towards the pro, that has the pro attacking the status quo and the con defending the status quo, with a few twists in wording that open up or block some arguments for each side. I want to talk about the wording first, then get into the common arguments on the topic. So, first off, the topic talks about continuation. Continuation is a limiting term in the topic, which makes it so that con doesn't just have to defend the policy's existence, but simply has to show that since they exist anyway, switching from them would be bad. This allows con a little extra leeway in that topics which, for instance, you might say this was never a good idea in the first place, that doesn't mean that suddenly canceling it wouldn't be a worse idea. So con doesn't have to defend the policies were optimal, it simply has to defend that now that we have them, we should stay the course. And that opens up a fair deal of offense in a lot of different examples for con. Pro obviously wants to talk about continuation in a more limiting term, but doesn't want to just say whether or not we should have to cancel these policies, but rather whether continuing along a track which involves creating similar policies or enforcing similar policies is a good thing. Generally speaking, though, pro isn't going to try and do nearly as much with continuation as con is. The other thing about continuation is it stops pro from looking at past impacts as much and makes them focus on the present and the future. More so the present than the future, because the resolution says does more harm than good rather than will do more harm than good. So it's not asking so much for predictive evidence, but it is asking about what these policies are doing now and will do more than what they have done in the past. Current is a term which, like many terms on the topic, pro is going to want the more broad version of, and con is going to want the more narrow version of. So current can mean either recent or ongoing. Recent is the more narrow definition. For instance, only things that have been started in the Obama administration or only things that have been started in the 21st century would be an interpretation of current that is limiting, that is narrow, and that con would like because it leaves them fewer policies they have to defend. Current meaning ongoing means any policy 1920s, 1960s, whenever, as long as it is still in place today, would be a current policy, and that's the definition pro wants because it limits the topic less and allows them a wider range of policies that they can attack. US obviously refers to the United States. If you're in a league where you would think it would refer to something else, feel free to ask me. We'll talk about the usual answers to those shenanigans, but I don't want to get into that on this topic analysis because it's nothing to do with this specific topic. Anti-drug policy is not a term of art. For whatever reason, whoever is writing the topics for the NFL these days, and it's not the wording committee, tries to avoid terms of art whenever possible, and I'm not really sure why. Any experts on this topic are not going to call it anti-drug policies. Generally speaking, when you hear anti-drug policies, it's talking more about policies to stop individual people from using drugs rather than national policies or foreign policy. Anti-drug policies tend to refer more to things like DARE in public schools, for instance, rather than a prohibition model in which countries have free trade agreements incentivized based on banning the same drugs the US does with similar penalties. So generally speaking, you're going to end up doing searches for terms other than anti-drug policy. That said, there's two ways to interpret the phrase anti-drug policy on this topic. One is ends-based, and one is intentions-based. So it could be anything which has the effect of reducing drugs, or anything that is intended specifically to reduce drugs. One definition would leave out anything that is supposed to reduce drugs but doesn't. The other definition would leave out anything that isn't meant primarily to reduce drugs but does so anyway. The resolution says nothing about illegal drugs, but you probably want to interpret this phrase in such a way that it does. There are ways to debate the topic, talking about legal drugs and the pharmaceutical industry and the resources going into that, but those are fairly narrow and really frowned upon by many judges and confuse many people, so I'm not going to get into them in this main analysis. Again, if you have questions about that and you are considering doing that for this topic, by all means, leave a comment or send me a message, and I'll talk about that in more detail. In Latin America is the next portion of the resolution. In is an important limiting term. If the policies are in Latin America, that excludes legalization or criminalization in the United States. That excludes border control, and that excludes even many forms of interdiction. This means that we are talking about policies by the U.S. which have their effects within Latin America, which doesn't include most of the U.S., may include the U.S. Virgin Islands, may include Puerto Rico, but generally speaking, that's not what we mean by in Latin America. It's used as an alternative as opposed to within the United States. So this topic is talking primarily about foreign policies, trade policies, foreign aid, so on and so forth. Latin America is a catch-all term. It is more cultural or linguistic than it is geographic. It includes most of Central America, most of the Caribbean, and most of South America. You could certainly make the arguments that countries without the same Spanish colonial background and without any kind of Latin culture are not part of Latin America, which would exclude Brazil, would exclude French Guiana, would exclude the Dominican Republic and Haiti, but at the same time, enough experts who talk about Latin America include those countries that the contextual definitions are going to favor an inclusive definition on the part of those countries. At the same time, that's not such a big deal, since there are going to be very few impacts that are specific to those countries, and the ones that are will often come as spillover from their neighbors anyway, so those countries are going to be part of impact, whether or not they are themselves part of Latin America. Again, does versus will do limits what continuation affects in the resolution, so it's the present more than projections of the future, but there's not too much to that term. It's not going to be an issue in 99% of debates, and more harm than good is the weighing mechanism for this topic. The weighing mechanism, however, lacks a definitive object. So more harm than good to the United States, more harm than good to Latin America, more harm than good to the world, more harm than good to national interests, to citizens. There's a lot of ways that this topic could have more harm than good interpreted. I would advise teams to have a contention that has impacts for Latin America and a contention that has impacts for the United States, at least. So you want two or more contentions covering both areas. If you do not, then you need a framing argument as to why doing more harm than good in your particular area is more important. Even if you do start out covering all your proverbial bases, you still probably want to think about what those framing arguments would be in case you're winning a contention that shows it is beneficial to the U.S. and they're winning a contention that shows it's harmful to Latin America. So that, for instance, you don't have to win your entire case to win the round. You can collapse down to one overarching idea in your final focus and have the weighing already planned for that. So I would think in those terms, even if you are planning to cover both areas of where the impacts could be on this topic. So again, that's the wording as a whole. Let's talk about some specific arguments that are likely to come up. Generally speaking, literature on the drug war is going to favor pro more than it favors con. Very few people write that the current prosecution of the drug war is awesome or is flawless. Many people write about flaws in it. Link turns abound for the pro side in this particular area. Nearly every goal they can argue that we are being counterproductive towards. At the same time, con can easily put the burden on pro to show that the sudden disappearance of these policies would achieve those goals better. The damage may have already been done, and at this point, consistency is an important virtue. Similarly, a lot of the things that the U.S. could change that the pro-literature will advocate for cannot be changed without offering a plan, and even if other teams are able to get away with offering some kind of pseudo-plan as an opportunity cost, then it still really cannot be offered because it would be something that would be done in the U.S. or require DEA cooperation or require some change of United States laws rather than what's changed in Latin America. Most Latin American countries model their drug laws on the U.S.'s as conditions of aid or as conditions of trade agreements. Those countries are going to be in a position where if the U.S. were to change its policies, they would probably change theirs to mirror it. But at the same time, that's outside the scope of the resolution, so pro can't get any easy argument off of that. Pro has to prove that these policies, as they exist right now, are causing harm, not that, say, legalization would cause less harm. Generally speaking, these anti-drug policies are going to split into two major categories. One's intended to reduce supply, and one's intended to reduce demand. Programs that are intended to reduce supply are only really worth defending for con if either the impacts come from the drugs themselves rather than the effects of the drugs, or if they can reduce supply by 100%. Otherwise, reducing supply just increases demand, and even if fewer drugs are being sold, the drugs are being sold for more money, and the impacts as far as funding cartels or enabling terrorism are still going to be just as strong. So you either need to show that you're completely cutting off supply, or you need to show that reducing supply is a benefit in and of itself. There are fewer drugs being sold, fewer drugs being used, and that's where impact comes from, rather than the economic impacts or the stability impacts or the rule of law impacts that can be built off of that. Without that, you want to look at what would affect demand. So that would be something which is designed to make fewer people want to buy the drugs, even if they're still being produced, which would in turn encourage people to either grow other crops other than what would make the drugs, or to sell their crops to a more legitimate source rather than to a drug cartel, because the demand simply isn't there for them to be more profitable than more conventional agriculture. So an example of reducing supply would be spraying herbicides on fields in Colombia to kill coca plants, or burning down stuff as per the Merida Initiative in Mexico, where drug cartels are growing fields of marijuana. Those would be examples of trying to reduce supply. Trying to reduce demand would be the U.S. giving foreign aid that is specifically earmarked to rehabilitation programs in other countries, to then, as a result of that, cause fewer drugs to be grown because fewer people want them in the first place and there's less of a market for them. Reducing demand in the U.S. is only a policy in Latin America. If you're looking at an effects-based version of it, you could say that current U.S. policy to reduce demand in the U.S. reduces the supply coming from Latin America and reduces the prices, which reduces the funding that ends up being used from these drug cartels to go to shady areas. Speaking of funding for drug cartels, while this is mainly an issue with Mexico and Colombia, it's also going to be an issue in other countries as well, and you don't need to limit yourself to one country in your contentions, though picking one country or two countries to focus on as primary examples is useful. Just don't make the contentions solely about those countries, make them about the broader principles, using those countries as examples. For instance, if I'm talking about human trafficking in Mexico on con, I might say that the Sinaloa cartel is in the crime business rather than in the marijuana business or in the cocaine business. Effects to reduce cocaine will just cause them to focus more on marijuana. Effects to reduce marijuana and cocaine will cause them to focus more on smuggling people into the U.S. to manufacture methamphetamines. Reducing all of those might just cause them to switch more towards arms trafficking and human trafficking instead, which is just as bad because they're not particularly tied to any one way of making money. So those trade-off arguments can be used as defense for con most commonly, but also potentially as turns, depending on whether or not pro is on their game. Other issues are going to be whether the U.S. taking a leadership role in this is important, and whether that itself is counterproductive based on how many countries in South and Central America and the Caribbean have reacted to U.S. imperialism in the past, particularly during the Cold War, particularly when you're looking at countries where the U.S. has supported drug-funded guerrillas in the past, but is now trying to encourage governments to clean up what many of the governments feel is the U.S.'s mess in the first place. Other issues revolve around how the U.S. drug policy allows other countries to challenge U.S. leadership, in particular Venezuela. The situation in Venezuela, as a result of Chavez's death last week, is going to change between now and many April tournaments, but it's important to look at both how Venezuela funds groups which are involved with drugs, like the FARC in Colombia, and it's important to look at how their interdiction policies and their substance abuse policies and their rehabilitation policies differ from the U.S.'s and how they've rejected U.S. leadership. Simply having the U.S. be the one to shape the policy could be an argument on the pro or con side as far as U.S. leadership being good on the con side, or how the U.S. better taking a following role, letting the OAS lead or letting local countries lead, could certainly be a viable pro argument as well. There's a lot of individual areas from country to country that teams can focus on, whether you're talking about illegal immigration, whether you're talking about terrorism, whether you're talking about crime, whether you're talking about development. There's many things that tie into the drug war in Latin America. in terms of U.S. interests, U.S. direct military presence, intelligence presence, paramilitary presence, tacit funding of other countries' militaries, so on and so forth, that can be tied into regional stability and spillover, but a lot of times that is not necessary. Remember, with these short speeches, it's not always suddenly a search for the biggest impact. Most of the time, you're better off looking for the easiest impact to articulate a good internal link to and have a believable story that you can weigh against and make the other team's impacts seem either non-unique, tenuous, or far-fetched. There's not a whole lot else that goes into this topic. If you have questions about a specific country or a specific contention, by all means let me know. This is more preliminary analysis to just look at what the resolution means and what kinds of arguments it does and does not allow. Hope this helps. Again, feel free to send me a message if you have specific questions about a contention or a way to deal with the topic, and I will try and get back to you on this. This is many people's nationals qualifier topic. It's going to be the TOC topic, so there's certainly a lot of research that will be going into this. There's also certainly a lot of research already done on this topic in other events that can be translated effectively into public forum from Lincoln Douglas, high school policy, and college policy. Hope this helps. Let me know if there's anything else I can do with this.